The receptionist had just walked me toward the glass conference room for the final round of interviews when I saw who was already seated at the long table, and my ex-husband Grant looked up from his coffee with an expression that took him a full second to arrange into fake surprise, because he had known, of course he had known, that I would be walking through that door. Beside him sat Paige, the woman he'd left me for 2 years earlier, in a cream-colored blazer, with her hands folded on a leather portfolio, and beside her sat two people I didn't recognize, a man in his 50s and a younger woman with a company lanyard. And I understood before anyone said a word that this was not going to be a normal interview. Grant stood up, extended his hand across the table like we were strangers, and said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, that he wanted to be transparent with the hiring committee about a potential conflict, that he and I had a complicated history, and that in the interest of the company, he felt obligated to disclose some concerns about my professional conduct before the panel proceeded. He said it smoothly, the way he said everything, the same voice that used to talk me out of my own memory during our marriage. Paige nodded along beside him, and then she opened her portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper toward the center of the table, and she said, in a tone dripping with reluctance, that she had worked with me briefly at a previous firm and had witnessed things she couldn't in good conscience stay quiet about, that I had a documented history of taking credit for other people's work and mishandling client accounts, and that the committee deserved to know who they were really considering for a director role. The man in his 50s frowned down at the paper. The younger woman with the lanyard wrote something on her notepad. And I stood there in the doorway in the navy suit I'd pressed at 5 that morning, holding a folder of my own work samples that suddenly felt useless, watching two people I'd once trusted try to end my career in front of strangers. The man in his 50s, who I'd later learn was named Douglas, picked up the sheet of paper Paige had slid forward and read it slowly, his mouth pressing into a thin line. And the younger woman with the lanyard glanced up at me with the particular expression people wear when they've just been told something unflattering about a person and are deciding whether to believe it. Grant kept talking, filling the silence the way he always did, saying that he'd thought long and hard about whether to raise this, that it would have been so much easier to stay quiet, but that his commitment to the firm's values simply wouldn't allow it. He had a way of making his own cruelty sound like a burden he was nobly carrying. Paige added, in that soft, wounded voice she'd perfected, that she genuinely admired me once, which made it all the more painful to speak up, and she looked down at her folded hands, as if the weight of her own honesty were almost too much. The receptionist who had walked me in hovered awkwardly at the door, unsure whether to leave, and I remember thinking, with a strange detachment, that Grant had staged this perfectly. The timing, the seating, the single damning sheet of paper, all of it choreographed to land before I'd said a single word. I set my folder down on the edge of the table, and I did not sit, and I did not speak, and I watched Grant's confidence flicker for just a moment when I didn't react the way the old Simone would have. Grant and I had been married for 9 years, and for most of them I'd believed we were partners, that the sacrifices ran in both directions, that when I turned down a promotion to relocate for his career, it was an investment we were both making. What I understood only later was that Grant kept a ledger in his head where my contributions never quite counted, where the years I spent building his confidence and editing his presentations and covering our expenses during his 2 failed ventures were simply the natural order of things, invisible, the way air is invisible. I remember the night he made partner at his firm, how he thanked his mentor and his college roommate and the universe in his speech, and never once said my name, and how when I mentioned it gently in the car, he told me I was making his moment about myself. I remember the year I built an entire consulting side practice from my kitchen table, quietly, in the hours after he went to bed, and how when a client sent flowers to the house to thank me, Grant assumed they were for him, and I let him, because it was easier than watching his face when he realized they weren't. I remember him rearranging the framed photos in our living room one afternoon so that the wall by the front door, the first thing any guest saw, held only images of his achievements, his diplomas, a photo of him shaking hands with someone important, and how he moved the one picture of me accepting an award to a hallway near the laundry room, and how I noticed and said nothing, telling myself it was a small thing, the way I told myself 100 small things were small, until they added up to a marriage in which I had become furniture. I remember Paige arriving in our lives as a junior colleague of Grant's, how she complimented my cooking and asked me for career advice, and sat at my dinner table a dozen times, and how the whole time she and Grant were building something behind my back that they would later describe, without any irony, as something neither of them could help. And I remember the day Grant told me he was leaving, how he framed it as a kind of favor to me, said I'd be happier with someone who matched my energy, and how he and Paige were married within 6 months. While I was still finding his socks in the back of a drawer, I remember the divorce itself, how he fought me over a set of dishes we'd received as a wedding gift while conceding the retirement account without a blink, because the dishes were something he could win visibly, and the account was just numbers on a page, and how that told me everything about what had actually mattered to him for 9 years. I remember a dinner party 2 years into our marriage where a client of mine, a man who'd flown in from out of state specifically to work with me, spent the evening praising my strategic instincts, and how Grant spent the drive home explaining to me, patiently, all the ways the client had actually been complimenting the firm, rather than me personally. I remember the time I was offered a keynote slot at a regional conference and turned it down because it fell on the weekend of Grant's company retreat, a retreat spouses didn't even attend, and how when I mentioned it years later, he had no memory of the retreat at all. And I remember, most sharply, the birthday when Paige, still pretending to be my friend, gave me a beautiful journal and told me I should write down my accomplishments so I wouldn't forget them, and how I'd found the gesture touching at the time, and how I understood now that she'd been studying me even then, cataloging the very insecurities she and Grant would later try to use against me in a room full of strangers. What Grant and Paige did not know, what nobody in that glass conference room knew except the general counsel of the company and one very senior board member, was that 18 months earlier, I had quietly earned a specialized professional credential and been recruited onto the advisory board of the parent company that owned the very firm now interviewing me, that I had spent the past year consulting at the highest level on exactly the kind of restructuring this director role was meant to execute, and that the reason I was in the final round at all was not because I'd squeaked through a competitive process, but because a board member who'd worked with me directly had personally suggested I come see the operation from the inside before deciding whether to formalize a much larger role. I had told no one, not my family, not my closest friend, because after 9 years of watching Grant treat my accomplishments as either threats or extensions of himself, I had learned to keep the important things quiet until they were solid enough that no one could take them from me. The director position Grant and Page were trying to torpedo was, frankly, a step down from what the board was actually considering me for, and I had come to this final interview partly out of genuine interest, and partly because I wanted to understand the culture of a firm I might soon have real authority over. Grant thought he was blocking a desperate ex-wife from a job she needed. He had no idea he was auditioning, badly, in front of someone who would soon have a say in whether he kept his own. I remember the day Eleanor Voss first reached out, a call from a number I didn't recognize, her assistant asking whether I'd be willing to meet the following week to discuss a consulting engagement, and how I'd assumed it was a mistake until I sat across from Eleanor herself and realized she'd read every piece of work I'd published under my own name over the previous decade, work Grant had never once bothered to read. I remember earning the credential, The months of study crammed into evenings and weekends, sitting for an exam in a testing center surrounded by people 15 years younger than me, and the quiet, fierce satisfaction of passing it on the first attempt. A satisfaction I told no one about because I'd learned that the moment I let Grant see something I was proud of, he found a way to make it smaller. I had built this entire second life in the dark, deliberately, the way you might build a shelter you hope you'll never need. And the strangest part of walking into that interview was realizing that the shelter had become a fortress while I wasn't looking, that the woman Grant and Paige thought they were ambushing had quietly become one of the most credentialed people in the building, and that they had no idea, none at all, that they were pointing their little slideshow at someone the board had flown in to evaluate them as much as anything else. 6 weeks earlier, when I'd first applied through the normal channels as a kind of test, Grant must have seen my name cross a system he had access to, because what followed over those weeks was a coordinated effort I only pieced together later. A series of quiet conversations he and Paige had with people in the firm, planting doubts, framing me as a problem before I ever arrived, so that by the time I walked into that final round, the ground had already been prepared. I learned the shape of it slowly from people who came forward afterward. A recruiter who mentioned that someone had warned her about me before my file even reached the committee. An assistant who recalled Grant asking pointed questions about the interview panel's makeup. A partner who'd been told in confidence that a former colleague of Grant's had concerns worth keeping in mind. Grant had built the trap with the same patience he'd once used to build a career. And the cruelest part was how well it might have worked on the old me, the version of myself who still flinched at his disapproval, who might have walked into that room already half convinced she didn't deserve to be there. But I was not that woman anymore. And Grant's fatal error, the one he never saw, was assuming I was. Assuming the person he'd spent 9 years shrinking would still fit inside the small shape he'd carved for her. And now, having laid that groundwork, they escalated it into a public event. Because a week after that first ambush in the conference room, the firm convened what they called a values and integrity review, a formal meeting prompted by the concerns Grant and Page had raised, attended by the hiring committee, 2 senior partners, a representative from human resources, and, joining by video, a compliance officer from the parent company. Grant and Page had clearly expected this meeting to be their finishing move. Grant stood at the front with a slideshow, actual slides, walking the room through a timeline of my supposed misconduct, invoices he claimed showed me billing clients for work I didn't do, an email he said proved I'd taken credit for a junior colleague's analysis, and a general narrative of a woman whose charm hid a pattern of dishonesty. He had clearly spent hours on it. The slides were animated, color-coded, each accusation building to the next. And watching him present it, I recognized the same meticulous energy he'd once put into the presentations I used to edit for him late at night. And I thought about how strange it was to watch a skill I had helped him sharpen, now aimed directly at my own throat. He'd even given the presentation a title, something bland and corporate about protecting organizational integrity, as if a document built entirely to destroy one person could be dressed up as a matter of policy. Paige spoke after him, softer, playing the reluctant witness, saying it gave her no pleasure to confirm any of this, but that she'd seen it firsthand. And she dabbed at her eyes at exactly the right moment. And I noticed that she'd dressed carefully for the part. Muted colors, minimal jewelry. The costume of a woman who wanted to appear too honest to be capable of scheming. A senior partner named Douglas, a man I would come to like a great deal, listened with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. And once, when Grant made a particularly sweeping claim, I saw Douglas glance sideways at the HR representative, with an expression I couldn't quite read, but that gave me the first small flicker of hope that not everyone in the room was buying it. And I sat in the second row with a leather folder in my lap, saying nothing, because I had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you can do to a person building a lie is let them finish it. Right at the peak of Grant's presentation, while he was clicking to a slide with my name in red letters, my phone vibrated against my leg, and it was a call from my sister, who never called during work hours. And I stepped into the hallway to answer it because some instinct told me it mattered. It was our mother. She'd been taken to the hospital that morning with chest tightness and shortness of breath, and my sister's voice was doing the thing it does when she's trying not to frighten me, going flat and careful. And for 6 minutes, the entire drama of that conference room dissolved into nothing. There was only my sister describing the emergency room and the tests, and our mother asking, apparently, whether I was doing okay at my big interview. I stood in that hallway with my back against the cool wall and understood that my mother, hooked to a monitor in an emergency room 2 states away, was worried about me, about whether I was okay. And something about that put the whole performance in the next room into a scale where it weighed almost nothing. My friend Renata, who I'd asked to come with me for support and who had been waiting in the lobby, found me in the hallway and put her hand on my arm without a word. She told me something that stuck with me, that she'd spent years watching Grant shrink me one small comment at a time, and that the woman standing in this hallway was not the woman who'd let him do it, and that whatever happened in that room, I'd already won the part that mattered by no longer being afraid of him. She said the thing about people like Grant was that they mistook silence for weakness, that they never understood a quiet person could simply be a patient one, and that Grant had spent so many years talking over me that he genuinely believed I had nothing to say, when the truth was, I'd just been waiting for a room worth saying it in. My sister texted a photo then, our mother sitting up in the hospital bed with an oxygen clip on her finger, giving the camera an exasperated thumbs up, under a caption that read, "She's already trying to sign herself out," and I laughed out loud in that hallway, a startled sound, because even flat on her back in an emergency room, our mother was more of a force than Grant had ever been. Renata told me to go back in there and let them finish digging, because the deeper the hole, the less I'd have to do, and that the most powerful thing I could do was simply hand the room the truth and step out of its way. My sister called back to say the initial test looked reassuring, that they thought it was likely anxiety and a mild reaction to a new medication, not her heart. And I exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. And then I straightened my jacket and walked back into the room to end this. When I walked back in, I didn't raise my voice. I waited for Grant to finish his slide, and then I asked the compliance officer on the video screen whether I might address the committee directly. And before Grant could object, the senior board member who had recruited me, a woman named Eleanor Voss, who had been listening silently from a seat near the back that everyone had assumed belonged to an assistant, stood up. I watched Grant's face change because he recognized her. Everyone in that firm recognized her. She was the parent company's name on the door. Grant had been at a company event once where Eleanor gave the keynote, had come home talking about her for a week, about how a single word from her could make or end a career in the group. And now here she was rising from a chair he'd walked past without a second glance, in the very room where he'd staged his ambush. "Before we go further," Eleanor said, her voice calm and carrying, "I think this committee should understand that the candidate you're reviewing was recruited to our advisory board 18 months ago, holds a credential most people in this room don't, and has spent the past year consulting on the exact restructuring this role reports into. I recommended her for this process personally." She let that land, and then she added, almost as an afterthought, that she had also been sitting quietly in the room for the entire presentation, watching two employees of a firm she oversaw spend an hour attempting to publicly destroy a candidate, and that she found the performance extremely informative, though perhaps not in the way its authors had intended. The quiet that followed had a different texture than the quiet Grant had been cultivating all meeting. It was the quiet of a room realizing it had been looking at the wrong person as the one in trouble. Paige's hand, I noticed, had stopped moving. Grant said too fast that this didn't change the concerns about my conduct, that credentials didn't excuse dishonesty. And Eleanor said mildly that she agreed completely, and that was exactly why she thought the committee should now examine the evidence very carefully. All of it, starting with whatever Grant and Paige had brought. So I opened my folder, I pulled up the first piece, the invoices Grant claimed showed me billing for work I didn't do, and I laid beside them the signed client contracts and delivery confirmations for that exact work, along with written testimonials from the clients themselves praising the results. And I pointed out that Grant's copies had conveniently omitted the second page of each invoice, the page that itemized the deliverables. I passed the complete versions down the table so each person on the committee could see for themselves, and I watched the younger woman with the lanyard compare Grant's version against mine, and then look up at him with a new expression on her face. Grant said the second pages could have been added after the fact, and I said that was a fair thing to check, and asked the HR representative to note that the clients themselves were available to confirm the timeline, and that the delivery confirmations carried timestamps from the firm's own document system that Grant was welcome to verify, and I moved on. I pulled up the second piece, the email Grant said proved I'd stolen a junior colleague's analysis, and I showed the full thread rather than the single message he'd screenshotted. A thread in which that same junior colleague thanked me in writing for mentoring her through the analysis and explicitly credited me as the lead. And I noted that the colleague, whose name was Priya, had gone on to become a director herself and would, I suspected, be unhappy to learn her gratitude had been twisted into an accusation. Grant said the thread was incomplete, that there were other emails that told a different story, and Eleanor said, without any heat, that she had her assistant contacting Priya directly at that moment, and perhaps Grant would like to wait for the response before characterizing it further. And Grant, for the first time, said nothing at all. Then I pulled up the third piece, and this was the one that turned the room, because it was not about my work at all. It was a set of messaging app conversations between Grant and Paige. Conversations Paige herself had forwarded to me a year earlier, during a brief window of guilt she later pretended never happened, in which the two of them explicitly discussed, in writing, how they would frame me if I ever competed for a role at a firm connected to Grant, how they would get ahead of it by seeding concerns early, and how in Paige's own typed words, they just needed the story in place before anyone thought to ask me directly. The room absorbed that in stages. I read the operative message aloud, the one where Grant wrote that the beauty of it was that Simone would never see it coming because she still trusts us. And I let that sentence sit in the air of that conference room, still trusts us, next to the two people who had just spent an hour describing me as the dishonest one. Douglas, the senior partner with the crossed arms, uncrossed them. Paige started to say that the messages were taken out of context, that they'd been venting during a stressful time. And I pulled up the fourth piece, a longer stretch of the same conversation in which they coordinated specific false claims, assigning each other lines to deliver. Paige volunteering to play the reluctant witness because, as she put it in writing, people believe a woman who cries. I read that line aloud too. People believe a woman who cries. And then I looked at the dampness she'd been dabbing from her eyes throughout the meeting, and I did not say anything because I did not have to. The room made the connection on its own, and I watched Paige realize that every tear she'd shed for effect had just been revealed as a tool she'd described in her own words. The HR representative set down her pen. The compliance officer on the video screen asked, in a careful voice, whether those messages could be authenticated, and Eleanor said that the parent company's counsel was already prepared to have them examined, and that in her experience, metadata rarely lied even when people did. Grant tried one more time, saying that I had clearly manipulated Paige into sending those messages, that this was all part of some long game of mine. And Douglas, the senior partner, finally spoke, and he said only that he had been in the room for the entire meeting, and that the only person who had walked in with a coordinated slideshow designed to destroy someone was Grant, and that he'd like the record to reflect that. The younger woman with the lanyard was nodding now, openly, and the HR representative had turned to a fresh page and was writing quickly. And I understood the notes were no longer about me. Eleanor's assistant slipped back into the room and handed her a printed page, and Eleanor read it and then read the relevant part aloud. Priya's response, sent within minutes, stating in plain language that I had been the most generous mentor of her early career, and that any suggestion I had stolen her work was not only false, but the opposite of the truth. Paige stood up abruptly, said she wasn't feeling well, and asked to be excused. And Eleanor said evenly that she was free to go, but that the review would continue with or without her, and that leaving now would be noted. Paige sat back down. Grant had stopped clicking through his slides entirely, the projector still glowing behind him with a slide that had been meant to be his triumph, and now just hung there. My name in red letters, evidence of nothing except the effort he'd put into a lie. The room that had studied me warily an hour earlier was now studying the two of them, and every glance in their direction carried the particular weight of people revising, in real time, everything they thought they'd understood when they walked in. The reaction moved through the firm the way these things do, not all at once, but fast. By the end of that week, the hiring committee had not only cleared me, but had been quietly informed by Eleanor that I was under consideration for a role well above the one I'd interviewed for. Grant and Paige, meanwhile, faced the machinery they had tried to turn on me. The parent company's counsel confirmed the messages were authentic, and the firm opened a formal review into whether Grant had misused his system access to surface my application and coordinate a campaign against a candidate. A review that within a month ended with Grant being asked to resign rather than be terminated for cause, a distinction his lawyer apparently fought hard for, and that fooled no one in the industry. The review also turned up that Grant had accessed the applicant tracking system on more than a dozen occasions to monitor my file, a clear violation of the firm's own data policies, and that finding a loan would have ended his tenure even without everything else. Word of the resignation moved through the industry within days, and because ours is a small world where reputations are the only real currency, the version of events that traveled was not the sanitized one his lawyer had negotiated, but the true one. The one where a partner had built a slideshow to destroy his ex-wife and been undone by his own new wife's text messages. Paige, who worked at a related firm, found that the story of what she and Grant had done traveled faster than either of them expected, and a promotion she'd been promised evaporated, with a vague explanation about the timing not being right. A professional association that had been about to feature Grant in a leadership spotlight quietly pulled the piece. A speaking engagement Grant had been booked for at an industry summit was canceled, with a form email citing scheduling changes. Two clients who had followed Grant to his firm over the years quietly moved their accounts elsewhere once the story circulated, unwilling to be associated with the kind of conduct the review had exposed. Page's own firm, embarrassed to learn that one of its people had participated in a coordinated campaign against a candidate connected to their parent company, placed a note in her file and passed her over, not just for the promotion she'd been promised, but for a project lead role she'd assumed was hers. The mutual friends who had taken Grant and Page's side during the divorce, the ones who had described their affair as two people who simply fell in love, grew notably quieter once the review made clear what kind of people they'd been defending. Priya, the junior colleague whose gratitude Grant had weaponized, was so angry when she learned what had been done with her words that she wrote a letter to the firm's leadership on my behalf, unprompted, describing exactly what kind of mentor I had actually been. And Douglas, the senior partner, became an unexpected ally, telling me over coffee weeks later that in 30 years, he had never watched someone dismantle a lie as calmly as I had, and that calm like that only comes from a person who has spent a long time being underestimated. Grant asked to meet me 2 months later, and I almost said no. But in the end, I agreed to a single conversation in a public cafe, mostly because I wanted to see whether he would apologize or merely negotiate. He looked older, or maybe just deflated, and he wrapped both hands around a cup he didn't drink from, and he said he was sorry, that he'd panicked when he saw my name in the system, that some part of him couldn't stand the idea of me succeeding at a firm connected to his, that he understood now how much of our marriage had been him keeping me small so he could feel large, and that he was asking for my forgiveness because he had nothing left to lose by asking. He said he'd lost the job, that Paige had grown cold, that the industry had a long memory, and he was learning exactly how long. And I listened and noticed that even now, in what he was calling an apology, the center of every sentence was his own suffering, his losses, his consequences, and that not once did he mention the strangers I'd had to prove my honesty to, or the career he'd tried to end in front of them. He asked me whether there was any way we could put it behind us, whether I might put in a word somewhere given my new position. And there it was, finally, the actual purpose of the meeting surfacing through the apology like a stone through water. I let him finish. I told him I had spent 9 years of marriage and 2 years of divorce, slowly understanding that the problem was never that I'd made him feel small. It was that he could only feel large when someone near him was smaller. "You didn't just try to take a job from me, Grant," I said. "You tried to take it in front of a room full of strangers, so they'd all watch me lose. I can forgive the fear. I can't forgive that you wanted an audience for my humiliation. And I'm certainly not going to spend the authority I earned cleaning up the wreckage of the campaign you ran to keep me from earning it." He nodded like he'd expected exactly that, and he left his coffee untouched. And I watched him walk out into the afternoon looking like a man who had finally run out of people to blame. And I felt no triumph, only the quiet of a door closing that should have closed years before. That weekend, I flew to see my mother, who was home and recovering and already impatient with being told to rest. And I sat with her and my sister in the kitchen while my mother interrogated me about the whole affair. And when I finally told them the part I'd kept secret, the credential and the advisory board and the role the parent company was actually considering me for, my mother put down her tea and looked at me for a long moment and then started to laugh. A deep, delighted laugh, and said she'd spent 2 years worrying I'd been crushed by that man. And here I'd been quietly becoming someone who could buy his firm. My sister made me tell the conference room story 3 times, and each time she wanted more detail. The exact wording of Eleanor's introduction, the look on Paige's face, the moment Grant stopped clicking through his slides, and she said she wanted to remember every piece of it because she'd spent 2 years wishing she could have said something to Grant herself, and this was better than anything she could have said. My mother told a story I'd never heard about a woman she'd worked for decades earlier who had tried to take credit for my mother's ideas, and how my mother had handled it quietly and patiently and outlasted her. And she said she supposed that was where I'd gotten it, and I realized she was right, that the calm I'd shown in that room was something I'd learned from watching her my whole life without knowing I was learning it. We stayed up too late, and my mother fell asleep in her chair, and my sister and I covered her with a blanket and sat in the quiet. And I felt the particular peace of being surrounded by people who had never once needed me to be smaller so they could feel bigger. My sister asked me, in the low voice you use when someone is sleeping nearby, whether I was ever going to tell people the whole story, the credential, the secret year, all of it, or whether I'd keep it quiet, the way I kept everything quiet. And I told her I thought I was done keeping the good things secret, that I'd spent so long hiding my successes to keep them safe from one man, that hiding had become a habit long after the man was gone, and that I was ready to stop. She squeezed my hand and said it was about time, and that our mother had raised 2 daughters who were nobody's furniture. And we sat there in the dark kitchen a while longer, and I understood that whatever I'd lost in those 11 years, I'd walked out with the one thing Grant had never managed to take, which was the certainty of exactly who I was. A few weeks later, I formally accepted the larger role the board had offered, an executive position overseeing multiple firms in the group, including, as it happened, the one Grant had just left. But the twist, the thing I hadn't fully thought through in the glow of winning, arrived on my first week in the role, when I opened the personnel files and realized that accepting this job meant I now had authority over Paige's firm as well, that she now, technically, reported up through me, and that the woman who had cried on cue to destroy me was now going to spend her days knowing that her professional future sat in the hands of the person she'd tried to ruin. I sat with that for a while, because it would have been easy and satisfying in a small, ugly way to use it, to find a reason to make her life difficult, to let her feel some fraction of what she'd tried to do to me. Instead, I called the head of Paige's firm, and I made it clear that Paige was to be evaluated by exactly the same fair standards as everyone else, no better and no worse, that I would not touch her file personally, and did not want to, because I had spent 2 years clawing my way out from under one person's need to control another, and I was not about to become that person just because the chair had finally turned in my direction. I think about that a lot now, that the cleanest revenge available to me was the one I chose not to take, and that walking away from it felt better than any humiliation I could have arranged. Paige, for what it's worth, requested a transfer within the year to a part of the group I had nothing to do with, and I approved it without comment, because I understood that the hardest thing for her was not any punishment I might have devised, but simply the daily knowledge that I had held the power to ruin her, and declined, that I had turned out to be the exact opposite of the person she and Grant had spent so long insisting I was. There is a particular kind of victory in being underestimated by people who then have to watch you become everything they swore you weren't. And there is a deeper kind still, in reaching the top of the ladder they tried to knock you off of, and choosing not to kick it out from under anyone. I think about that glass conference room a lot, the one where two people I'd trusted tried to end my career in front of strangers, and the one where, a week later, the truth arrived one message at a time and rearranged everyone's understanding of who the dishonest person in the room had been. If you have ever had someone stand up in front of a group of people who mattered to your future and calmly tell a story about you that was designed to destroy you, you already know that the hardest part is not proving them wrong. It is deciding, once you have the power to hurt them back, what kind of person you actually want to be. So let me ask you something before you go. If the person who tried to ruin your career suddenly ended up working for you, could you resist the temptation to make their life miserable? Or is that a line you'd cross? Tell me in the comments. And if this story was worth your time tonight, hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you too.